For years, Brad Pitt seemed to have everything. The fame, the money, the awards, the Hollywood career most actors could only dream of. But behind that image was a man going through one of the darkest periods of his life. His marriage was falling apart. His family life was changing. And his relationship with alcohol had become a serious problem. Then Brad Pitt made a decision that would change his life. He stopped drinking. For 7 years, he stayed sober and tried to rebuild himself. But now, at 62, Pitt is finally talking about the pain he carried during those years. He has revealed that his emotional suffering became so intense that he could understand why someone might see death as an escape from pain. But Pitt made one thing clear. He was not saying that he was suicidal. He was describing what extreme emotional pain can feel like. And then came another surprising revelation. After 7 years without alcohol, Brad Pitt started drinking again. So what really happened to him during those darkest years? And how did one of Hollywood's biggest stars learn to rebuild his life after everything changed? This is the story Brad Pitt is finally ready to tell. Before Brad Pitt became the man trying to rebuild his life, he was one of Hollywood's biggest stars. But his rise did not happen overnight. In 1991, Pitt appeared in Thelma and Louise. He was only 27. He had a small role, but it was enough to make Hollywood notice him. Soon bigger roles followed. A River Runs Through It, Legends of the Fall, C7N, Fight Club. With every movie, Pitt became more famous. But he was more than a good-looking movie star. He proved that he could handle serious roles, complicated characters, and very different kinds of stories. By the late 1990s, Brad Pitt had become one of the most recognizable actors in the world. Then came another major chapter in his life. Jennifer Aniston. Their relationship became one of Hollywood's most famous romances. They married in 2000. For a while, they seemed like the perfect celebrity couple. But that marriage eventually ended. Then Pitt's life changed again. While filming Mr. and Mrs. Smith, he became involved with Angelina Jolie. Their relationship quickly became one of the biggest stories in Hollywood. Over the years, their family grew to include 6 children. Pitt was no longer just building a career. He was building a family. In 2014, he and Jolie married. From the outside, it seemed like Pitt had everything. A legendary career, a successful family, fame, money, and a life most people could only imagine. But Hollywood is very good at creating perfect pictures. And sometimes, the picture people see has very little to do with what is happening behind the scenes. By 2016, that picture was beginning to fall apart. His marriage was ending. His family life was changing. And the private struggles of Brad Pitt were about to become public. For the first time, the image of the perfect Hollywood life began to crack. In 2016, Brad Pitt's life changed in a way no movie role could prepare him for. After years of building a career and a family, his private life suddenly became the biggest story in Hollywood. In September 2016, Angelina Jolie filed for divorce. Almost overnight, their family became the center of worldwide attention. There were questions about the children, questions about the marriage, and questions about what had happened behind closed doors. For Pitt, this was no longer just a private family crisis. Millions of people were watching. Every headline, every photograph, every new report. Then came another problem that would become an important part of his story. Alcohol. Pitt later acknowledged that drinking had become a serious problem in his life. He eventually stopped drinking and began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. But getting sober was about more than giving up alcohol. He had to confront himself, the mistakes he had made, the choices he regretted, and the person he had become. Pitt later described those meetings as a safe place where he could be honest about the parts of himself he did not like. There were no cameras, no red carpets, no Hollywood image to protect. Just Brad Pitt sitting with other people and trying to understand what had gone wrong. He would eventually describe that period as a kind of reset, a chance to rebuild himself from there inside. But sobriety did not make everything disappear. The divorce continued. His relationship with his family became complicated, and the public attention never stopped. For someone who had spent most of his life being watched, this was a completely different kind of fame. People were no longer interested only in his movies. They wanted to know about his mistakes, his family, his struggles, and the man behind the celebrity. The years that followed would become a long process of rebuilding. There was no quick solution, no moment when everything suddenly became better. Pitt had to keep moving forward while living with the consequences of his past. And eventually, he would reveal just how painful those years had really been. The Hollywood star everyone thought they knew was entering the darkest chapter of his life. For Brad Pitt, getting sober was not one dramatic moment. It was a process, a long one. After the collapse of his marriage and the pressure surrounding his family, Pitt began confronting a problem he could no longer ignore: his relationship with alcohol. Pitt later spoke openly about joining Alcoholics Anonymous. For someone who had spent decades in front of cameras, it was a completely different experience. There were no reporters, no photographers, no fans, just people sitting together and talking honestly about their lives. And that was exactly what Pitt needed. He later explained that those meetings gave him a safe place to be honest. Not Brad Pitt, the movie star. Just Brad, a man admitting that he had made mistakes, a man trying to understand his own behavior, and a man who knew that simply stopping drinking would not solve everything. He had to change the way he lived. He had to change the way he dealt with pain. And most importantly, he had to take responsibility for himself. Pitt has also credited people who supported him during this period. One of them was actor Bradley Cooper. At a 2020 event, Cooper praised Pitt for his sobriety and the changes he had made in his life. That kind of support mattered, because recovery can be lonely, even when you are one of the most famous people in the world. Millions of people knew Brad Pitt, but fame could not solve his problems. Money could not fix them. Awards could not fix them. He had to do the work himself. Slowly, things began to change. Pitt stayed sober. He continued working. And he became more willing to acknowledge the mistakes he had made. But there was still one part of his life he rarely discussed: his family. For years, Pitt kept much of that story private. He did not explain every detail. He did not turn his pain into a public spectacle. Instead, he focused on rebuilding himself, one day at a time, one decision at a time. Eventually, he would spend 7 years without alcohol. 7 years of trying to become a different version of himself. But sobriety did not erase the past, and it did not erase the pain surrounding his family. That was the chapter Pitt would eventually begin talking about. The chapter he had kept private for years. 7 years. That is how long Brad Pitt says he stayed away from alcohol. For him, those 7 years represented much more than simply not drinking. They represented discipline, clarity, and the decision to keep moving forward. Pitt did not suddenly become a different person when he stopped drinking. He was still dealing with the aftermath of his divorce. He was still facing difficult family issues. And he was still trying to understand the choices he had made. But sobriety gave him something important: clarity. Without alcohol, he had fewer ways to escape difficult emotions. He had to face them. He had to accept the things he could not change. And he had to learn how to live with the past. Over time, Pitt became more open about his mistakes. He stopped trying to present himself as someone who had everything figured out. Instead, he talked about recovery as an ongoing process. Learning, accepting responsibility, and becoming more comfortable with who he was when the cameras were gone. His career also entered a new phase. He continued making major films. He starred in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and won an Academy Award for his performance. He also continued working as a producer. From there outside, it looked like his life was finally back on track. But success could not repair every relationship. An award could not erase the past. And sobriety could not make difficult family problems disappear. There were things Pitt could control. And there were things he could not. He could change himself. But he could not change other people. He could apologize. But he could not force someone to forgive him. He could become a better person. But he could not rewrite the past. Those may have been some of the hardest lessons of his recovery. And after years of sobriety, Pitt eventually reached another unexpected chapter. He started drinking again. To some people, that might sound like failure. But Pitt described it differently. He said he now drinks in a much more limited way. And he knows that drinking too much does not work for him. That admission changes the way we understand his recovery. It was never about becoming perfect. It was about understanding himself, his limits, his mistakes, and what he could handle. Because rebuilding a life is rarely a straight line. Sometimes you move forward. Sometimes you struggle. And sometimes you simply learn to make better choices. But even after 7 years of sobriety, one part of Pitt's story remained largely private. The pain surrounding his family. And in 2026, he finally gave the world a glimpse into just how difficult that period had been. For almost a decade, Brad Pitt kept most of the details private. He talked about sobriety. He talked about changing his life. But one subject remained largely off-limits. His family. The end of his marriage to Angelina Jolie became one of the biggest celebrity stories in the world. But the public only saw pieces of what happened. Headlines, court documents, photographs, statements from lawyers. The full emotional story remained private. Then in 2026, Pitt gave a rare glimpse into that period. During his conversation with Esquire, he was asked about the difficult years that followed the collapse of his family life. His answer was simple. Family stuff. Then he added we could leave it at that. It was only a few words. But they said a lot. Even after all these years, Pitt still wants to keep much of that period private. And that is understandable. There is a difference between telling your own story and revealing someone else's. Pitt and Jolie have 6 children. As the years passed, those children grew up and developed lives of their own. That meant the family story did not simply end when the divorce was finalized. It continued to change. And Pitt had to accept that some relationships could not be repaired simply because the legal battle was over. That is one of the hardest parts of a broken family. You can choose to leave a marriage, but you cannot simply walk away from being a parent. Their emotional consequences can last 4 years. And sometimes, the hardest thing is accepting what you cannot control. Pitt did not explain exactly what he meant by family stuff. He did not publicly blame one person. He did not reveal private conversations. And we should not fill in those blanks for him. What we know is that he described that period as deeply painful. Painful enough that he could understand why someone experiencing overwhelming suffering might see death as an escape. But there is an important distinction. Pitt did not say he was planning to end his life. He was describing what extreme emotional pain can feel like. And perhaps that is why his words have attracted so much attention. He was not giving the world the entire story. He was giving us a glimpse behind the Hollywood image, A glimpse of the man who had to deal with regret, addiction, family problems, and the consequences of his past. For years, Pitt kept that part of his life behind closed doors. Now, he has finally opened the door. Just enough for us to see how dark those years really became. There was one part of Brad Pitt's recent interview that caught everyone's attention. It was not about Hollywood. It was not about his movies. It was about pain. During his conversation with Esquire, Pitt reflected on one of the darkest periods of his life. He described emotional suffering so intense that he could understand why someone might see death as a way to escape. But his words need to be understood carefully. Pitt was not saying that he had planned to end his life. He was not describing a suicide attempt. And he did not say that he was currently in danger. He was trying to describe something much harder to explain. What happens when emotional pain becomes so overwhelming that thoughts you once could not understand suddenly make sense? For Pitt, that pain was connected to what he called family stuff. He did not explain exactly what happened. And he did not identify anyone. That silence matters. For years, the public has tried to understand what happened inside the Jolie Pitt family. There have been headlines, legal battles, accusations, denials, and endless speculation. But Pitt's latest comments do not provide a complete answer. They provide something more personal, a glimpse into what that period felt like for him. For decades, Brad Pitt was seen as almost untouchable. A movie star, a sex symbol, an award-winning actor, a Hollywood icon. But fame does not protect anyone from grief. It does not protect anyone from loneliness. And it certainly does not protect anyone from family problems. Pitt had to learn that lesson the hard way. He had to face his mistakes. He had to deal with regret. And he had to accept that some relationships might never return to what they once were. But his story also contains something important. Recovery. He stopped drinking. He found people he could talk to. He kept working. And slowly, he rebuilt his life. The pain did not simply disappear. He learned how to carry it. And that may be the most revealing part of his story. Brad Pitt is not presenting himself as a man who solved every problem. He is presenting himself as someone who went through a difficult chapter and learned from it. Because behind the movie star is something much simpler. A human being. Someone who can experience success and failure, love and loss, regret and hope. And perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. The man who once seemed to have everything discovered that fame could not protect him from pain. He had to face it himself. And he had to learn how to move forward. But just when it seemed that his story had reached a more stable chapter, Pitt made another unexpected admission. After 7 years without alcohol, he had started drinking again. And suddenly, the story took another turn. After everything Brad Pitt had been through, one part of his recent interview surprised almost everyone. After roughly 7 years without alcohol, Pitt revealed that he had started drinking again. For many people, that immediately sounded like a relapse, a return to the past, a sign that everything he had worked for was falling apart. But Pitt described it differently. He said he now drinks in a much more limited way. And he knows what happens when he drinks too much. It does not work for him. That distinction is important. Because this is not simply a story about quitting alcohol and then going back to it. It is about how Pitt says his relationship with alcohol has changed. For 7 years, he stayed away from drinking. During that time, he learned how to deal with difficult emotions without using alcohol as an escape. He learned how to sit with uncomfortable feelings. He learned to accept things he could not change. And he built a life that did not depend on running from the past. So why did he start drinking again? Pitt has not given one dramatic explanation. He has not said that a specific event caused it. And he has not described it as a sudden collapse. Instead, he appears to see it as a decision made with a better understanding of himself. That may be the biggest difference between Brad Pitt in 2016 and Brad Pitt today. 10 years ago, he was confronting a problem he could no longer ignore. Now, he says he understands his own limits much better. He knows what alcohol can do to him. He knows what happens when he goes too far. And he says he does not want to return to that version of himself. That is what makes his admission so interesting. We often imagine recovery as a straight line. You have a problem. You stop. You get better. And the story ends. Real life is rarely that simple. People change. People struggle. People learn. And sometimes they have to find a new way forward. For Pitt, those 7 years of sobriety appear to have given him something important. Awareness. He understands himself better now. And he understands his limits. That does not mean everyone will agree with his decision. Some people will see it as a setback. Others will see it as proof that recovery can take different forms. But Pitt's message seems simple. He knows what works for him. And he knows what does not. Perhaps that is the real meaning of his 7 years without alcohol. They did not make him perfect. They did not erase his past. And they did not fix every relationship. But they changed the way he sees himself. And now, at 62, Brad Pitt appears to be entering a very different chapter of his life. One where he is no longer trying to convince the world that everything is perfect. He is simply learning how to live with the life he has. At 62, Brad Pitt is in a very different place from the man the world knew 20 or 30 years ago. The movie star is still there. The fame is still there. But the image has changed. For decades, Hollywood presented Pitt as almost untouchable. The perfect leading man. The man who seemed to have everything. But time changes things that fame cannot protect. Pitt has experienced the end of a marriage. He has faced years of public scrutiny. He has spoken openly about his struggles with alcohol. And he has spent years trying to rebuild himself. He has also had to accept something difficult. Some things cannot be controlled. He can choose his movies. He can choose how he lives. He can choose whether he drinks. But he cannot control how other people feel about him. He cannot change the past. And he cannot force every broken relationship to become whole again. That may be one of the hardest lessons he has learned. For someone who spent most of his life being watched, learning what he could not control may have been more important than controlling everything else. And something else has changed. Brad Pitt no longer seems interested in proving that he has everything figured out. He appears more comfortable admitting that he does not. That is very different from the young Brad Pitt. Back then, he seemed almost invincible. Today, he seems more reflective, more realistic, and perhaps more honest. He has learned that getting older is not only about losing the things you once had. It can also be about understanding yourself better. Fame becomes less important. Approval becomes less important. And protecting a perfect image becomes less important. What matters is who you are when the cameras are gone. For Pitt, that journey is still continuing. There is no perfect ending. No moment when every problem disappears. No scene where every relationship is repaired and every regret is forgot. Real life does not work that way. Instead, there is a man who has spent years trying to understand his mistakes. Trying to rebuild. Trying to accept what he cannot change. And now, finally, talking about parts of his life he once kept private. Maybe that is what makes this chapter so different. Brad Pitt spent decades living under the brightest spotlight in Hollywood. Now, he seems less interested in explaining his life to the world. He seems more interested in simply living it. And after everything he has been through, that may be the greatest change of all. Maybe the most important part of Brad Pitt's story is not what he lost. It is what he learned. For decades, the world saw Brad Pitt as almost untouchable. A Hollywood superstar, a man with fame, wealth, success, and a life that seemed impossible to break. But behind the cameras, his life became much more complicated. His marriage ended. His family life changed. Alcohol became a serious problem. And eventually, he had to confront parts of himself that fame could not protect. Getting sober did not erase the past. It did not repair every relationship. And it did not make the pain disappear. But it gave Pitt a chance to face his life without running from it. For 7 years, he stayed away from alcohol. He found support. He continued working. And slowly, he rebuilt himself. Years later, he started drinking again. To some people, that may look like failure. But perhaps it is more complicated than that. Recovery is not always a straight line. People change. People struggle. People learn. And sometimes, moving forward means understanding yourself better. At 62, Brad Pitt seems less interested in protecting the image of the perfect movie star. He appears more willing to admit that he has made mistakes, that he has experienced pain, and that some parts of his life may never be completely resolved. But he still keeps certain things private. And perhaps that is exactly how it should be. Not every painful experience needs to become public. Sometimes healing means knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Brad Pitt has spent almost his entire adult life in front of the world. Now, he seems more interested in living his life than explaining it. Maybe that is the real lesson behind his darkest years. You can have fame. You can have money. You can have success. And still feel completely lost. But being lost does not mean your story is over. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of a different chapter. Brad Pitt's story does not have a perfect ending. And perhaps it does not need one. He is still working, still changing, still carrying the past, and still moving forward. After everything he has been through, maybe Brad Pitt no longer needs to convince the world that his life is perfect. He only needs to live the life he has now. And after decades under Hollywood's brightest spotlight, that may be the closest thing to freedom he has ever found. If you found this story interesting, subscribe to Gilded Secrets for more untold stories, hidden struggles, and the moments behind the lives of the world's most famous stars. Because sometimes, the story behind the celebrity is far more fascinating than the celebrity we thought we knew.